Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, please forgive a little bit longer layout because of the subject matters involved are worthy of it. 2969 would establish employment protections for first responders with a mental illness, such as PTSD. This bill was brought to me by a firefighter in my district who's here today in the gallery. We're really glad that you're here. The stresses faced by firefighters throughout the course of their careers, multiple casualty events, violence, injury to children, and the inherent dangers of firefighting can have a cumulative impact on mental health and well-being. Most firefighters recall with ease at least several horrific calls or tragic events that play over and over in their minds. Police officers, firefighters, and paramedics see stress, trauma, and death on a continuum. According to the Journal of Occupational Health, approximately 20% of firefighters and paramedics have PTSD. Another study conducted by Florida State University in 2015 discovered that 46% of firefighters have thought about suicide, 19% have made suicidal plans, and 15% have attempted suicide. In addition, firefighters with PTSD are 6 times more likely to attempt suicide. From speaking with the Firefighters Association, I've learned that an overwhelming number of firefighters are taking advantage of peer support, but they are more apt to talk to a firefighter from another department, in large part because firefighters are scared to talk about PTSD and emotional health in their own departments because of the stigma associated with it, including job loss. What this bill does is give support to first responders as they suffer from PTSD, and it encourages people to seek treatment. The bill specifies that employers are permitted to take the necessary course of action for first responders that are a potential danger or threat to their coworkers and or the public. This bill would help to eliminate the stigma surrounding mental illness by making it safe to communicate about emotional health and wellness and removing a threat of job loss and financial distress. This bill is supported by the Texas Association of Firefighters, CLEAT, TMPA, Association of Texas EMS Professionals, the NAMI Texas, and the National Association of Social Workers. Members, this is just one way we may better serve our first responders who put their lives in harm's way every day to protect our communities. Thank you, members. If there are no questions, I move passage.
Mr. Speaker.
Representative Dutton, for what purpose?
Gentleman yield for a question.
This gentleman yield for questions.
Thank you. Yes, I do.
Gentleman yields.
Thank you. Now, the bill talks about, well, let me ask this first. Do we do this for any other group of employees?
I'm not advised.
Okay. And the bill talks about adverse employment actions.
Yes, sir.
What are those?
Well, those would, we could define those in this section, but I expect them to be things like suspension, termination, reduction of wages, and demotions.
Well, suppose he doesn't get a raise. Would that be an adverse employment action?
I would not consider that an adverse employment action.
You said,
I would not.
That would not be.
I would not consider that one myself.
Employment action. Now, and so, if one of these employees has mental health issues,
yes,
you simply don't want them to be terminated solely for having a mental health issue, right?
Yes, sir. That's correct.
Well, does that mean that if the conduct which comes from the mental health illness, you couldn't be terminated for that or something?
No, sir. There's a provision in the bill that does allow for terminations to proceed if it puts the public or coworkers in danger.
Yeah, but the bill says it has to be subject to public safety. The public safety exception is created in the bill.
Yes, sir.
And what I'm asking is, if the officer behaves in a certain way and the behavior is caused by his mental illness, does this bill presuppose that you can't, as an employer, take action against the employer?
I think the bill presupposes that the employer would have in place programs and resources available that would be they'd be processed through prior to termination.
So if the employee engages in an activity that doesn't immediately cause public harm or challenges public safety in some respect, the employer could not take an adverse action against that employee.
That would be the intent, yes, sir.
So if the employee decided to get on a bridge and he was going to jump off, he couldn't be terminated at that point simply because he had a mental illness which was causing him to get on the bridge to jump off.
That's a hypothetical situation.
Right. Well, that's why I'm trying to understand the bill, because I'm not sure what conduct the bill is trying to say falls within the exception of the public safety exception, and what conduct you're not getting at all.
I'm not a professional firefighter or a first responder of any kind. However, I would think that the departments would know if the conduct would be dangerous to those whom they're trying to serve and would take appropriate action.
Because, see, when you talk about the employees having PTSD, I think we all probably have a number of friends who are military veterans who come home.
Yes, sir.
And one of the things they're claiming is PTSD, but we don't provide any employee protections for that class of employees. And I just wondered why we would extend that to this group. And not that I don't like firefighters or police officers or emergency personnel. I just wonder where does this stop?
Well, this group of employees, if you will, or public servants, are unique in the fact that they encounter a continual exposure to trauma, which compounds perhaps their PTSD
Which is why one of the things we do is we change their retirement system so that they retire much earlier than any other group of employees. We provide certain pay benefits for them that we don't provide for other employees, and we provide opportunities for them to go to college under certain conditions where they pay less than what a normal citizen would pay. And now what we're saying is you can't even be terminated, or an employer can't take an adverse employment action against you if it's based on your mental illness.
Well, this bill is necessary because the current culture is that you can't disclose safely within, let's take the fire station, to your superior that, hey, I'm having a bad mental health day without risk of losing your job on the spot. And in fact, there are instances of that exact scenario playing out.
And then the bill, what it also does, I'm not sure members are paying attention to this, but it waives sovereign immunity. Are you aware of all of the instances where we waive sovereign immunity against the governmental entity?
I would not supposed to be aware of all of those, as you state, no.
But so for example, if one of us live here and there are certain conditions under which we could be injured as a result of a government employee action, and we'd have difficulty getting around the sovereign immunity of it. And like I said, I just wonder how far are we going to go with this? Because now what we're saying is an employer can't take action against an employee because of their mental illness, except if you're a firefighter or a police officer or EMS person. Those are the only groups of employees that we restrict an employer's action from doing anything. I mean, I think, a lot of doctors obviously probably have PTSD from exhibiting or witnessing all the trauma that they experience. I would even suggest that even school teachers are in a job that's filled with, at least to some of them, what would be considered to be enough to cause them to have PTSD. And so why don't we do this for them? Why don't we do it for school teachers?
Well, there are many worthy occupations, Chairman Dutton. However, this bill is focused on first responders.
I understand that, but I'm just concerned about why we continue to limit the first responders. I mean, it seems to me not to be reasonable for this body. And I know it's easy to get up with something for firefighters and police officers and all these other people because it's difficult for us to say as a body, we don't agree with that. But at some point, there ought to be a line beyond which we just simply don't go. We simply don't go there. We won't go there because we recognize that there's a difficult job. They have a difficult job. I admit that. I admit that the job is difficult, and when I call 911, I want the fire department or the police department or EMS to come. But what I don't want to do is I don't want to create these exceptions, keep creating these exceptions such that they don't do anything to help protect public safety. They do more to increase the cost. But my real concern is, so under your bill, an employer would have to wait until the mental health condition manifests itself in some bad act on the employee.
No, sir.
You wouldn't? Well,
No, sir.
you could do it before that?
Well, no, this helps create a culture where first responders can go ahead and report to their superiors about having a bad mental health day without fear of losing their job or being demoted or being suspended. So,
Well, you're saying the employee with the mental health condition can go to the employer and try to get...
that would be the aim, because right now the culture does not allow for that.
Well, that's kind of like asking a drunk person whether they're drunk almost.
Well,
Because,
I wouldn't equate first responders with PTSD with drunk people, Mr.
well,
Chairman.
I'm not equating that. I'm equating it to you suggesting that the person with PTSD will automatically go to their employer to seek help for the mental health problem they've got. I'm just suggesting to you that if you've got such a mental health problem that's manifesting itself that way, you're probably not going to go to anybody for help. You're probably not going to go seeking help because you don't realize you need help.
Well, sometimes they seek help today. However, they're not seeking it within readily available resources. They're going across town or across the Metroplex or across the county to a different department for fear of losing their job. So they'll find peer support groups, nowhere close.
If they're doing that, why do we need the bill?
Because it shouldn't be, there shouldn't be a culture that fosters automatic termination when an employee tells their boss that they're suffering from PTSD.
So you're saying to me, as a police officer, if I say that, you know, I'm suffering from PTSD, I've got a mental health issues, that the employer ought to allow me to stay on the street?
No, sir. Actually, this helps promote public safety, because if you have a culture of being able to report and self-report, then you're less likely to go out and put the public at risk.
So my question though is, as a police officer, would this restrict me from going to my employer to make a claim that I have suffering from mental health issues?
This bill would encourage that type of reporting.
For you to go forward?
Yes.
And in most cases, I think police officers have to meet a behavioral test that says they're still competent to serve as a police officer. And if you have mental health issues, you're basically saying you can't do that. So do you understand the conflict? That there's an intrinsic conflict here, because police officers have to be mentally competent to stay on the job. But what you're saying is that if they're not mentally competent and they go to their employer, they still get to stay on the job, despite the fact that their behavioral competency is not met or their mental competency is not met. That's what concerns me. And it's not against police officers or firefighters or EMS. It's just the fact that I'm wondering if we're cementing in law the ability of municipalities to take action when a police officer has problems. I agree that ought to happen, but the way this bill is structured, what's going to happen is now the police officers who have the mental health problems will just simply stay on the job by going and tell the employer that they had suffering from this. And until the employer gets to a point where they say it affects public safety, they can't do anything. And I don't think that's what you want, is it?
I don't know that you've described the bill and its outcomes accurately.
Well, I hope that my take on it is different. I hope it's wrong.
Thank you, Chairman Dutton.
Representative Schaefer, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for some
Does the
questions?
gentleman yield for questions?
Yes, sir, I will.
The gentleman yields.
Okay, Representative Sanford, let's say we have a small town police department. Maybe they have 2 full-time police officers. And one of those officers becomes clinically depressed. And that's a mental health diagnosis. What was that small town department? How do they treat that person now?
The bill doesn't prescribe I don't know how they treat it now, and the bill doesn't prescribe how they would. However, what they could not do is, under this bill, fire that police officer on the spot.
Can they ever fire them for that reason?
We have multiple pieces of testimony, if you will, and which brought rise to this bill and supported in committee of instances of people being, mostly firefighters, fired on the spot.
Okay, so I guess my question is like, in my mind, a normal progression is if someone became, say, clinically depressed and they couldn't function in their job, you would have disability. That person could leave employment and receive disability payments long term. You'd have a plan for that. But you have a small town, you have 2 police officers, one of them becomes clinically depressed, and this bill says they cannot be terminated, and let's say this illness lasts for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and now you have a small town. Does that person have to show up to work every day? Is that person entitled to raises? What do they do? I mean, I'm really thinking like a small town mayor or city manager. What do they do?
Well, what they cannot do is take an adverse employment action under this bill for the reporting of that condition by the police officer.
I know, but I mean, you're talking about the resources of a small town, even towns that may be a little bit bigger than that, 4 or 5 police officers full-time. You're now talking about, a payroll requirement of maybe $100,000 with all the benefits or more.
Well, surely, Mr. Schaefer, you aren't advocating for the ability to terminate that police officer even in a small town on the spot because they report a mental illness.
No, I'm not. I'm really not. I'm trying to understand the end. I know, I love and appreciate the
end would be having a culture within the police department or fire department or first responders that allows for a reporting of having a bad mental health day without fear of losing your job and being able to access resources to hopefully be a better employee down the road, a better public servant, and having a safer culture there in the station.
And I agree. I think that's a wonderful goal. I'm just trying to understand a long-term situation is what I'm trying to say, Representative Sanford. Everything you're saying is valid, and I agree with it.
But there is nothing long-term about a firefighter, police officer, or first responder, EMS professional who gets fired that day and loses his job because he had a mental health day. There's no long-term promise for him.
Mr. Stevenson raises a point of order. The gentleman's time has expired. The point of order is well taken and sustained. Is there anyone? Chair recognizes Representative Toth to speak for the bill.
Members, in 1999, a very close friend of mine, a police officer by the name of Chad Robichaud, was called out on a domestic disturbance call. When he and his partner, Steve, arrived on the scene, The perpetrator pulled his gun and was trying to commit suicide by cop. Chad and Steve put 13 rounds into this guy's chest in his home in front of the Christmas tree in front of children as the man tried to commit suicide by cop. His testimony goes on to talk about how it destroyed his life and it destroyed his marriage. He became suicidal. He became depressed. And what Mr. Dutton does not understand about post-traumatic stress as it relates to first responders, that these are individuals that have sworn an oath to stand between people that want to harm us and defenseless people. You can have post-traumatic stress in just about any situation in life, in any job that you take. But what's different about first responders is that they sign up for us to stand in the gap for us. Post-traumatic stress is not a disorder. In fact, the military doesn't call it a disorder today. Post-traumatic is a normal response to an aberrant situation that no person should have to deal with. It's a normal response. It's no different than when a kid puts his hand on the stove, burns it, and then has a reaction to not want to go there again. It's a learned muscle response from the limbic system, and we need to stand in the gap to help these guys when they come into a traumatic situation. This is the right thing to do. We want to create a culture where first responders don't have to be afraid to admit that they've got a problem. They don't have to worry about losing their job, losing their home, going into bankruptcy, losing their family, because they've got a problem. We owe it to these people to help them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chair recognizes Representative Dutton in opposition to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, listen up. Mr. Toth says I don't understand PTSD. Well, that may be true. But what I understand is this. I don't care who it is. If they've got a gun, I don't want to run into them and they're suffering from a mental illness. And I don't care whether you're a policeman. I don't care whether you happen to be a preacher. If you've got a mental illness and a gun, I hope that me and my family don't have to run into you. What this bill does is protects the employment of first responders who are suffering from mental illness on their job, and this says you can't even terminate them. It also says, it's even broader than that. It says you can't take an adverse employment action with them, against them. Adverse employment actions include a person thinks they ought to have a raise and you don't give them one. That's an adverse employment action. A person gets suspended. That's an adverse employment action. Members, what I'm telling you is this, is that I love police officers, I love firefighters, and I love EMS people. But what I don't like is I don't like somebody with a gun having a mental illness out in the community. That's what we ought to be protecting against. And what this bill ought to be doing is saying that, well, what it does is this, members. It says it takes the bar down and lowers the bar. It says that cities don't even have the protections of immunity from suit against these kinds of suits. You don't get that here because they have taken that out. What they allow the cities to do is absolutely nothing when it comes to a police officer. And let me tell you, to explain this to you. When a police officer says he's competent for duty, he's saying he's mentally competent for duty too. What this bill presupposes is that he admits not only to himself, but to his employer that he's not mentally competent for duty. And the employer can't terminate him. The employer can't have an adverse employment action against him. So what does he do? That means he has to go back out on the street. If we want to do anything for these police officers who have PTSD and are suffering from a mental illness, we ought to make sure that they can go to get help and get it done. That's the only way. You don't protect them by saying, we're going to let you stay on the job. But the way to protect them is, and the way to protect our communities is to give them an opportunity to get to a doctor and express their sentiments there so that all of a sudden you don't have competency, mental competency is not challenged as a result of him suffering from some mental illness. I just don't think this is proper. And Mr. Speaker, if somebody has a question and Mr. Bell has a question, I'll be glad to answer. Do you have a question? You done? Okay. Well, members, I think this bill is just misdirected. I think it is intended well. I think what Mr. Sanford intends is to help the first responders, but you don't help the first responders if you're hurting the community. If you're hurting this community, you're not helping first responders, because if you want to help them, we ought to do one of the things that we've been trying to do is give them more training. That would help first responders because they respond to their training based on certain circumstances as opposed to responding on the basis of their emotions. But if that person is mentally ill, has suffering from a mental illness, I will share with you that God help us if that person also has a gun, and I don't care whether he's a police officer or just a person in the neighborhood. And you ought to vote against this this bill, members.
Does anyone else wish to speak on for or against House Bill 2969? If not, the chair recognizes Representative Sanford to close.
Thank you, members, for...
Mr. Speaker.
Representative Bell, for what purpose?
Would the gentleman yield for a couple questions?
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
Yes.
The gentleman-
Representative Sanford, this particular piece of legislation is part of a work group study, as I recall, that came out of the House Bill 1794 that this body passed.
Yes, sir.
And the intent of that was for first responders to identify why that 10 times greater likelihood of taking their own lives and other things, why they're not accessing the mental health care that's available to them. And inside this piece of legislation, you're seeking to address one of those items that were identified in that, which is stigma and other aspects. This bill, on page 2 of this bill, what does it say about those individuals and their mental health? I think if you look, it talks about discrimination prohibited on page 1, starts line 22, runs through line 24, and then moves over to the next page. But on line 1, I think it has some limitations to the protection or defense that's in this bill.
Yes, sir.
I think it says that if it's solely a diagnosis that they can't be released or can't be released from employment just because that they've gone and sought mental health counseling.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and so but other adverse conditions, if they had a crime or something like that, this doesn't prohibit acting on any of those types of issues.
You're correct.
If we're serious about protecting our first responders, we cannot not pass legislation like this that'll protect them when they need access to care, and all they need is to see that mental health professional. They're not prohibited. They're not in a condition where they can't do the job. Is that your understanding of the bill?
That is my understanding, and thank you for your past work on this issue, Representative Bell.
Well, thank you for your carrying of the bill, and I think it's a good bill that takes care, it balances between the needs of our first responders while also making certain that society is protected if they have any other issues that go beyond that. And I thank you for carrying the bill.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Representative
And I'll
Bell.
be voting for you, Bill.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Representative Romero, for what purpose?
Does the gentleman yield for
Does the
question?
gentleman yield for questions?
sir, I will.
The gentleman yields.
Representative, so in the bill, it only says mental illness. It doesn't define mental illness. And Representative Toth talked about PTSD. Was there any conscious effort to recognize a specific diagnosis and what type of diagnosis you were concerned with that an officer could not be fired for? There's some mental illnesses, situational disorder. Those things can be dealt with much more differently than someone who may be schizophrenic, bipolar, varying degrees of mental health illnesses. So what effort, what discussion, and why was there not anything put into the bill about different levels of mental illness?
Well, we worked with several stakeholders, of course, in crafting the bill, and the most prevalent of mental illnesses that the first responders work with or have to work through by far is PTSD, and so that was most forefront in our minds as we crafted the bill.
So just
But the bill does not limit it to PTSD.
so it's not limited. So if you had someone that had a lesser of the mental health illnesses, that's an example, situational disorder, just a change of place, change of family life, something that's causing them trauma, does that mean that person could be off the clock, if you will, for a long period of time without an ability for that government entity to take some sort of get back to work action?
Well, if there is a mental illness, then the bill just simply states that there could be you can't take adverse employment action against them solely because of that mental illness.
So my point is, could you be opening the door for someone that has not PTSD but a situational disorder? I'm going to continue to go back to that sort of the first level of mental health illnesses.
No, I'm afraid
and that person not to come back to work, but that's still a mental illness. It is a defined mental. It's a diagnosis.
Now, this bill tries to. Right now, the door that first responders are seeing if they report a mental illness is the door out the job. And that's the door we're trying to close.
Well, I absolutely agree with your intent of your bill, and that's why I'm asking, was there any discussion as to what type of mental illness the first responders are seeing more? What input you had from the mental health professionals, whether it's psychiatrists, psychologists, go on and on, social work, whatever it may be, and was there some effort that could have been put into your bill that would have dealt with the more severe mental illnesses?
Well, I suppose you could try to delineate all the different mental illnesses that are out there, but we didn't want to do that because of the trauma can manifest itself in so many different illnesses, if you will, down the road, that to try to prescribe those ahead of time. For instance, I talked to you about we mentioned earlier the suicide statistics, where 46% of firefighters have thought about suicide.
Representative, I am totally on board 100% with defending our first responders and any government entity and not be able to fire them for sake of the help that they need. I'd be the last one to ever tell you that I believe that the stigma is something that we should all be very conscious of that exists, and we should work. And I know that that's what you're working on. Yeah. So I'm supportive of your efforts, and certainly supportive of our first responders. I just didn't know if that might be that just the term mental illness wasn't defined as much as you could.
I think
and what input there was from firefighters and the mental health professionals.
It's defined well in other aspects in code, I believe, and then we wanted to leave it broad enough to catch all of the potential job-related and traumatic disorders that might arise.
Well, I'd like for you to consider it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I close. Thank you.
Question occurs on the passage to engrossment of House Bill 2969. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say nay. The ayes have it. House Bill 2969 is passed to engrossment.